The historical genesis of the catastrophic confrontation at the Alamo in the freezing winter of 1836 was rooted deeply in a volatile, decade-long convergence of irreconcilable political ideologies, cultural frictions, and territorial ambitions. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded within the crumbling stone walls of the old San Antonio de Valero mission, one must look back to the early 1820s, when a newly independent Mexican republic, desperate to populate and secure its vast, untamed northern frontier against hostile Comanche raids, opened the fertile lands of Coahuila y Tejas to foreign colonization. Under the initial entrepreneurial leadership of impresarios like Stephen F. Austin, thousands of American immigrants, predominantly from the southern United States, flooded into the territory. They were lured by the promise of cheap, abundant cotton land and a progressive, highly decentralized federalist governance guaranteed by the landmark Mexican Constitution of 1824. However, this massive influx of Anglo-American settlers, who brought with them their deeply ingrained notions of Jacksonian democracy, common law legal traditions, and the deeply problematic institution of chattel slavery, rapidly transformed the demographic and cultural balance of the region, sparking intense anxiety within the political elite of Mexico City. By the early 1830s, the fragile relationship between the centralized Mexican government and the increasingly defiant Texian colonists had reached a dangerous, irreversible boiling point. The political landscape of Mexico was violently upended by the meteoric rise of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, a charismatic, ruthlessly ambitious military opportunist who proudly styled himself as the Napoleon of the West. Initially campaigning as a champion of liberal federalism, Santa Anna executed a radical, authoritarian political pivot once firmly entrenched in the presidential chair. He systematically abolished the Democratic Constitution of 1824, dissolved the National Congress, crushed regional state legislatures, and concentrated absolute, dictatorial power within his own executive office. For the Texian settlers, as well as many native Mexican federalists known as Tejanos, Santa Anna's aggressive centralization represented an existential threat to their fundamental civil liberties, property rights, and economic autonomy. When the dictatorial regime deployed federal troops to enforce heavy customs duties, disarm the local citizen militias, and aggressively suppress any whispers of regional autonomy, the spark of armed rebellion was officially ignited across the frontier, transforming peaceful farmers and merchants into reluctant, fierce revolutionaries. The opening shots of the Texan Revolution were fired in October 1835 in the small, dusty settlement of Gonzales, where a defiant group of local militiamen stood over a small brass cannon lent to them by the Mexican military for Indian defense, raising a crude white flag emblazoned with the iconic words, "Come and take it." The subsequent, rapid escalation of the conflict saw an ad hoc, highly undisciplined army of Texian volunteers and adventurous American volunteers successfully drive the formal Mexican federal garrisons out of the territory, culminating in the historic, blood-soaked siege of Bexar in December 1835. During this brutal, house-to-house urban conflict, Texian forces under the veteran leadership of Ben Millam systematically forced General Martin Perfecto de Cos, Santa Anna's own brother-in-law, to formally surrender his massive, well-equipped regular army inside San Antonio. Following this stunning, unexpected victory, the vast majority of the Texian volunteer forces, foolishly believing that the military struggle was completely over and that the Mexican government would simply accept the territorial loss, abandon their military posts, and return to their distant families, leaving only a tiny, highly fragmented, and undersupplied caretaker garrison to defend the strategic frontier outpost of San Antonio de Bexar. This strategic outpost centered entirely around a decomposing, century-old former Spanish Franciscan mission known locally as the Alamo. Constructed originally in the early 18th century as a religious outpost to convert the local indigenous populations, the compound had long since lost its theological purpose, serving sequentially as a temporary military barracks for a Spanish cavalry unit from San Carlos de Parras, from whom the site derived its popular name, Alamo, meaning cottonwood, before being utilized as a primitive fortress during the turbulent wars of Mexican independence. Architecturally, the compound was never designed to withstand a modern, heavy artillery siege conducted by a professional, highly disciplined European-style army. It was a sprawling, highly irregular 3-acre enclosure defined by low, crumbling adobe walls, fragmented limestone structures, and an incomplete, roofless stone church whose facade stood completely exposed to the open air. The defensive perimeter was far too vast and structurally fragile to be adequately manned by a standard military company, requiring an immense, multi-thousand-man force to properly secure every angle, barricade every gate, and protect against a coordinated, multi-directional infantry assault. As the unpredictable winds of January 1836 swept across the cold Texas plains, the military leadership of the Provisional Texan government was deeply divided, highly chaotic, and paralyzed by intense personal rivalries and political infighting. The supreme commander of the regular Texan Army, General Sam Houston, possessed a highly pragmatic, long-term strategic vision of the conflict, recognizing with absolute clarity that the Alamo was a dangerous, indefensible death trap that lay hundreds of miles away from the primary population centers of Anglo-Texas. Houston dispatched the legendary, highly formidable frontier knife fighter and volunteer Colonel James Bowie to San Antonio with strict, explicit orders. Bowie was instructed to systematically dismantle the remaining iron artillery cannons, explode the deep powder magazines, completely abandon the crumbling mission structures, and retreat eastward to establish a secure, highly defensible front line behind the broad waters of the Guadalupe River. However, when the deeply charismatic, fiercely stubborn Bowie arrived at the outpost, he was profoundly struck by the immense strategic symbolism of the position, viewing it as the indispensable western gateway that successfully blocked the primary military invasion routes into the heart of Texas. Upon inspecting the compound, Bowie found that the local commander, a dedicated regular Army engineer named Colonel James C. Neal, had performed a series of near-miraculous engineering feats with the extremely limited resources at his disposal. Working alongside a handful of exhausted men, Neal had successfully salvaged over 20 diverse iron and brass artillery pieces left behind by General Cause's retreating army, systematically mounting them along the high earthen ramps and wooden platforms constructed inside the roofless church and along the low stone walls of the main plaza. This impressive collection included a massive, terrifying 18-pounder iron cannon, which was formally positioned at the southwestern apex of the compound, pointing out across the open prairie as a roaring, defiant symbol of Texian revolutionary resolve. Neal forcefully convinced Bowie that if San Antonio fell to the centralist dictatorship, the entire revolutionary cause would be permanently crushed in its infancy. Deeply moved by Neal's unyielding dedication and completely infected by the romantic spirit of frontier defiance, Jim Bowie chose to explicitly ignore General Houston's strategic directives, writing an impassioned, historic letter to the provisional governor in which he solemnly declared, "The salvation of Texas depends in great measure on keeping Bexar out of the hands of the enemy. Colonel Neal and myself have come to the solemn resolution that we will rather die in these ditches than give it up to the enemy." The operational command of the vulnerable garrison underwent a significant, highly tense transition in early February when Colonel Neal was forced to temporarily leave the post due to a severe family medical emergency, formally turning over control of the small regular army detachment to a brilliant, intensely ambitious 26-year-old lawyer turned cavalry officer named William Barrett Travis. A native of South Carolina, Travis was a deeply romantic, highly dramatic individual who viewed the Texan revolutionary struggle through the grand, idealized lens of classical literary heroism and ancient Roman civic virtue. He wore a custom-tailored, bright blue dress uniform, carried a fine, polished sword, and possessed an unquenchable desire for historical immortality. Travis's sudden assumption of regular army command immediately triggered a bitter, dangerous authority crisis within the walls of the Alamo. The vast majority of the garrison consisted not of disciplined regular soldiers, but of fiercely independent, highly anti-authoritarian volunteer fighters who flatly refused to take operational orders from a rigid, young, aristocratic martinet like Travis. Instead, the volunteer contingent held a democratic election on the main plaza, choosing the legendary, rough-and-tumble Jim Bowie to act as their independent colonel and commanding authority. This dangerous internal division threatened to completely paralyze the defensive preparations of the garrison, creating a highly volatile, fractured dual command system where Travis governed the small regular cavalry units while Bowie dictated the movements of the heavily armed volunteers. The intense personal friction between the two ambitious commanders was only resolved by a sudden, tragic physical intervention. Jim Bowie, whose legendary physical strength had been deeply eroded by years of hard living, severe alcohol consumption, and the early stages of a devastating, advanced pulmonary disease, likely advanced tuberculosis or severe typhoid pneumonia, collapsed completely on the stone floor of the mission, rendering him entirely bedridden and physically incapable of maintaining his operational duties. Recognizing his own physical collapse, Bowie formally, reluctantly turned absolute, singular command of the entire combined garrison over to William Barrett Travis, establishing a unified leadership structure just as the dark, terrifying shadow of the Mexican army began to crest over the southern horizon. The spirits of the deeply stressed, isolated defenders were immensely elevated during this critical period of internal crisis by the unexpected, highly dramatic arrival of a legendary American historical icon, David Crockett, the famous former United States congressman, expert frontier sharpshooter, and celebrated bear hunter from the wild woods of Tennessee. Having recently suffered a devastating political defeat in his home state, Crockett had famously packed up his trusted long rifle, nicknamed Old Betsy, and traveled down to the revolutionary frontier of Texas, seeking to completely reinvent his political career and secure vast tracts of land for his family. He arrived in San Antonio at the head of a small, elite band of 12 fiercely loyal, heavily armed sharpshooters known proudly as the Tennessee Mounted Volunteers. Unlike the arrogant, highly demanding European-style military officers, Crockett refused any formal rank or special privileges within the garrison, choosing instead to sleep on the hard wooden floor alongside the common privates, using his legendary frontier humor, master storytelling abilities, and skilled fiddle playing to continuously maintain the psychological morale of the men during the cold, dark nights of waiting. While the small garrison inside the Alamo spent their days repairing the low earthen barricades and searching for scarce food supplies in the abandoned town, they were operating under a profound, near-fatal intelligence delusion regarding the precise movements and terrifying speed of their primary adversary. William Barrett Travis and his scouts were firmly, comfortably convinced that General Santa Anna could not possibly launch a major military offensive into Texas until the late spring of 1836, believing that the absolute lack of fresh grass for cavalry horses and the brutal, sub-zero winter storms would naturally force the Mexican army to remain safely cantoned south of the Rio Grande until April. This was a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. Driven by an intense, burning fury over the humiliating surrender of his brother-in-law General Cause, Santa Anna had systematically organized a massive, multi-thousand-man punitive expedition known formally as the Army of Operations, launching a forced, high-speed winter march across hundreds of miles of desolate, waterless desert terrain during one of the most severe, freezing blizzards in North American history. The suffering of the common Mexican conscripts, many of whom were unhardened Mayan Indians forcibly drafted from the tropical jungles of southern Mexico, completely unaccustomed to sub-zero temperatures and clothed only in thin white linen uniforms and cheap leather sandals, was absolute and horrific. As the massive military columns pushed deeper into the freezing winds of the northern deserts, hundreds of soldiers, camp followers, and essential pack mules collapsed from acute hypothermia, severe dehydration, and physical exhaustion, their frozen, unburied bodies left behind along the icy trails to mark the path of the dictator's advance. Yet Santa Anna, operating with a cold, tyrannical indifference to human suffering, continuously drove his vanguard forces forward, sacrificing men and animals without a single moment of hesitation to ensure that he would completely catch the arrogant Texian rebels by surprise before they could organize a cohesive national government or gather a centralized army. On the fateful, overcast morning of February 23rd, 1836, the comfortable illusions of the defenders were permanently, violently shattered. The local citizens of San Antonio, noticing the sudden appearance of elite Mexican cavalry scouts on the distant ridges of the Alazan Hills, began to frantically pack their meager belongings into wooden carts and flee the town in a state of absolute, chaotic panic. Travis, refusing to believe the initial reports, dispatched two trusted scouts, John Sutherland and John William Smith, to ride up into the hills to verify the enemy's presence. Within less than an hour, the two riders came galloping back through the dusty streets at a terrifying speed, their horses foaming at the mouth, confirming with absolute, breathless terror that a massive, professional army of thousands of Mexican troops had completely encircled the town. The first, faint, rhythmic drum beats of the approaching vanguard were beginning to thrum against the cold earth, a sound that would soon grow to drown out all other human concerns, leaving only the stark, undeniable, and terrible reality of the fight for the Alamo. The sudden, chaotic arrival of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's vanguard cavalry elements on the afternoon of February 23, 1836, permanently transformed the tranquil, dusty streets of San Antonio de Bexar into an armed theater of absolute, ideological warfare. As the frantic civilian population fled the town in a sea of wooden carts and crying children, William Barrett Travis acted with a frantic yet highly calculated military urgency. He officially ordered his scattered garrison of regular cavalrymen and heavily armed volunteers to immediately abandon their temporary quarters in the town square, retreat across the narrow wooden footbridge over the San Antonio River, and withdraw completely behind the thick stone walls of the Alamo mission. In their haste, the defenders systematically scoured the abandoned local houses, successfully seizing over 80 bushels of native Indian corn and dragging dozens of panicked cattle into the open corral of the compound. A minor, yet incredibly critical logistical acquisition that would serve as their primary lifeline against the early ravages of the incoming blockade. By late afternoon, the magnificent, glittering columns of the Mexican Centralist vanguard, specifically the elite Dolores Cavalry Regiment and the heavily armed infantry battalions of Jimenez and San Luis, marched into the main plaza of San Antonio with their polished brass bayonets gleaming beneath the overcast winter sky. Santa Anna, riding at the head of his brilliant staff officers, immediately established his centralized command headquarters within the historic San Fernando Church, located directly across the river from the defiant Texian fortress. To send an absolute, chilling psychological message to the rebels, the dictator ordered his buglers to blow the terrifying, high-pitched notes of the Degüello. an ancient, blood-curdling Moorish war chant that formally signaled a war of absolute extermination. Simultaneously, a massive, blood-red banner was slowly hoisted into the sky atop the bell tower of the San Fernando church. The meaning of this crimson flag was stark, undeniable, and terrifyingly clear under the established rules of Mexican military law. It signaled no quarter. No mercy would be shown, no diplomatic prisoners would be taken, and every single rebel caught with a weapon in their hands would be systematically executed on the spot as a treacherous pirate against the sovereign state. Seeing the blood-red flag unfurl across the river, the fiery, independent-minded Jim Bowie, who was still capable of short periods of physical movement before his devastating pulmonary disease completely paralyzed his body, acted entirely on his own volatile initiative, without consulting his co-commander William Barrett Travis. Bowie deeply understood the complex cultural and political nuances of the Mexican military mentality, having married into a prominent, high society Tejano family years prior. Seeking to gauge whether Santa Anna's harsh stance was merely a piece of dramatic political theater or a literal military decree, Bowie dispatched a trusted regular Green volunteer named Jameson to cross the river footbridge under a white flag of truce, carrying a hastily written formal letter addressed directly to the Mexican command, politely inquiring if a parley could be established to discuss honorable terms of military capitulation. When the messenger returned with a cold, insulting written response penned by Santa Anna's aide-de-camp, Colonel Juan Almonte, the fragile illusions of diplomatic safety were permanently shattered. The Mexican response flatly stated that the centralist government would never negotiate with lawless foreign filibusters, and that the only terms available to the Texian garrison were an absolute, unconditional surrender at the discretion of the dictator, warning that any individual who refused to lay down their arms immediately would be put to the iron sword. Travis, discovering Bowie's independent diplomatic maneuver, was absolutely furious at the breach of military protocol, viewing it as a weak, humiliating display of revolutionary resolve. To completely undo Bowie's message and reassert his own unyielding aristocratic command, Travis walked up the earthen ramp to the southwestern platform, drew his sword, and personally ordered the massive 18-pounder iron cannon to fire a roaring, thunderous defiance directly across the river at the town plaza. The massive iron ball blasted through the adobe structures near the Mexican headquarters, signaling with absolute, earth-shattering finality that the garrison inside the Alamo would rather be completely buried beneath the stone rubble than submit to the tyranny of the centralist dictatorship. The operational reality of the siege rapidly settled into a grinding, highly tactical, and psychologically exhausting war of attrition that unfolded beneath a succession of freezing winter rainstorms. Santa Anna, demonstrating a highly sophisticated understanding of European siege methodologies, refused to launch an immediate, costly frontal infantry assault against the mounted artillery of the Alamo. Instead, he ordered his highly trained regular engineers to construct a series of deep, zigzagging entrenchments and hidden artillery breastworks that crawled closer and closer to the mission walls with each passing night. Under the cover of darkness, Mexican military units systematically deployed heavy bronze howitzers and iron field pieces along the banks of the river, launching a continuous, terrifying bombardment of heavy explosive shells and solid iron shot directly into the interior plazas of the compound. The continuous, deafening roar of the artillery echoed across the lonely Texas plains, turning the dark nights into a terrifying display of flashing fire, shattered timber, and exploding mud, systematically depriving the isolated defenders of any meaningful sleep and keeping their psychological nerves at a dangerous, hyper-vigilant breaking point. Inside the crumbling compound, William Barrett Travis found himself operating in a state of near absolute strategic isolation, fully realizing that his tiny, fragmented force of roughly 150 fighters was mathematically incapable of holding the sprawling 3-acre perimeter for more than a few days without massive, immediate reinforcements of men, gunpowder, and heavy provisions from the eastern colonies. Sitting by the dim light of a single tallow candle inside his cold, stone quarters in the low barracks, with the walls vibrating continuously from the impact of Mexican artillery shells, the 26-year-old commander dipped his quill into ink and penned what would become one of the most celebrated, emotionally stirring documents in the entire history of global liberty. His immortal letter addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. Every single word of Travis's historic missive bled with a profound sense of tragic classical heroism and unyielding civic defiance. He wrote with an absolute, breathtaking clarity. Fellow citizens and compatriots, I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. I have sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours and have not lost a man. The enemy has demanded a surrender at discretion. Otherwise, the garrison are to be put to the sword if the fort is taken. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. He closed his impassioned plea with a powerful, desperate invocation of ancient martial honor, making a solemn, ironclad vow that would echo through the generations. I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid with all dispatch. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible, and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country, victory or death. This desperate, historic letter was placed into the leather pouch of a highly trusted, iron-willed courier named Captain Albert Martin, who slipped out of the Alamo's northern postern gate in the dead of night, riding a swift war-horse through the porous Mexican cavalry lines and galloping eastward across the freezing, muddy prairies to distribute the call to arms to the distant settlements of Goliad, San Felipe, and Gonzales. Travis's underlying, realistic strategic hope rested almost entirely upon a massive, well-equipped regular Texian army detachment located roughly 90 miles to the southeast in the coastal fortress of Goliad, under the formal command of Colonel James W. Fannin. Fannin was a West Point-educated officer who governed over 400 highly disciplined, uniform-clad volunteers from the United States, representing the largest, most formidable concentrated pool of revolutionary military power anywhere on the Texas frontier. Upon receiving Travis's urgent, blood-stained appeal, Colonel Fannin initially attempted to respond with a massive relief march, mobilizing over 300 of his men and packing his heavy artillery cannons onto heavy wooden transport wagons. However, the relief expedition was doomed from its very inception by a catastrophic, complete lack of logistical organization and military discipline. Within less than a single mile of leaving the walls of Goliad, several massive ammunition wagons broke their wooden axle trees in the deep mud. The oxen teams starved due to a complete lack of winter forage, and the men were forced to camp on the open, freezing prairie without adequate blankets or provisions. Paralyzed by indecision and receiving contradictory intelligence reports that a massive Mexican division under General José de Urrea was rapidly advancing up the coastline to cut off his retreat, Fannin made the highly controversial, strategically defensive decision to completely abandon his march to San Antonio. He ordered his men to turn around and withdraw completely back into the fortifications of Goliad, effectively abandoning the isolated defenders inside the Alamo to their tragic, solitary fate beneath the shadow of Santa Anna's growing army. As the siege dragged past its first agonizing week into early March, the physical and psychological toll on the defenders inside the Alamo reached a critical, dangerous peak. The relentless winter winds dropped temperatures to near freezing, and the lack of firewood forced the men to systematically dismantle the interior timber partitions of the old mission structures just to cook their meager rations of boiled corn. Jim Bowie's physical condition had deteriorated to a truly horrific extent. He was now completely bedridden within a small, dark room in the low barracks, coughing up thick sheets of blood and suffering from an intense, continuous delirium that left him entirely detached from the operational command of the fort. David Crockett, however, remained an unyielding, tower-like source of psychological stability on the main plaza. He seemed to be present everywhere at once, walking the exposed parapets during the heaviest bombardments, using his incredible frontier marksmanship to systematically picking off any careless Mexican artillery crewmen who showed themselves within 1,000 yards of the walls, and constantly using his legendary humor to prevent the common volunteers from sliding into a state of paralyzed, fatalistic despair. The strategic monotony of the blockade was briefly, dramatically shattered on the freezing, pitch-black night of March 1st, 1836. Creeping silently through the deep brush along the western banks of the river was a small, intensely brave column of 32 heavily armed men from the small settlement of Gonzales, led by Captain Albert Martin and the veteran scout John William Smith. These men were ordinary farmers, lawyers, and merchants who had received Travis's impassioned letter and made the conscious, deeply heroic decision to explicitly ride into a completely surrounded fortress, fully realizing that their chances of survival were practically zero. As they approached the dark southern walls of the Alamo, a panicked Texian sentry, mistaking them for an incoming Mexican ambush party, fired a wild shot that grazed the foot of one of the riders. After a frantic exchange of whispered passwords, the massive wooden gates of the compound were swung open, and the immortal 32 rode proudly into the main plaza under a shower of wild cheers from the ecstatic garrison. While this minor reinforcement brought a massive, invaluable surge of psychological joy and emotional relief to the exhausted defenders, it did absolutely nothing to alter the cold, brutal mathematical reality of the conflict. Travis's total fighting force was now raised to roughly 189 men, while across the river, the massive, relentless machinery of General Santa Anna's army was growing larger with each passing dawn, as thousands of elite regular reinforcements systematically completed their long winter march from the interior of Mexico. By the morning of March 3rd, 1836, the relentless mechanical pressure of the centralist siege machine had advanced to a point of near absolute tactical suffocation for the isolated garrison within the Alamo walls. Under the direct, unyielding guidance of General Santa Anna's engineering officers, the Mexican infantry battalions had successfully completed a series of advanced, subterranean trenches that brought their heavy bronze howitzers within less than 200 yards of the northern and eastern adobe walls of the old Franciscan mission. The continuous, terrifying bombardment had now transformed from a sporadic psychological harassment into a rhythmic, systematic demolition of the fort's structural integrity. The ancient limestone facade of the roofless church was heavily fractured, and massive sections of the low earthen barricades along the main cattle corral were constantly sliding into the dry ditches under the concussive force of solid iron shot. Inside the compound, the air was permanently thick with the bitter, choking stench of black gunpowder smoke, pulverized plaster, and the heavy, metallic smell of stagnant mud, creating a claustrophobic reality where any movement across the open plazas meant exposing oneself to a lethal hail of high-velocity lead musket balls. The atmospheric tension reached a dramatic, devastating climax late that afternoon with the sudden, exhausted arrival of James Allen, the final courier to successfully slip through the tight network of the Centralist cavalry patrols. Allen brought with him the absolute, definitive confirmation that the provisional Texan government was paralyzed by chaotic political factionalism, and that no large-scale military relief column from Goliad or San Felipe was coming to save the garrison from its imminent destruction. Realizing with absolute, icy clarity that their tactical situation had converted from a standard military holding action into a solitary, predetermined martyrdom, the 26-year-old commander William Barrett Travis ordered his entire fighting force of roughly 189 men to assemble immediately on the main plaza, utilizing a temporary lull in the Mexican bombardment to deliver his final, immortal address to his volunteers. The historical scene that unfolded beneath the gray, wine-swept Texas sky was a profound testament to the romantic, tragic classical heroism that Travis had chased his entire adult life. He stood before his exhausted, mud-stained men with his bright blue dress uniform torn and covered in stone dust, his face heavily lined with the immense physical strain of 10 consecutive sleepless nights. According to enduring frontier lore and historical memory, Travis looked upon his silent, heavily armed followers, drew his long, polished officer's sword from its scabbard, and slowly, deliberately dragged the steel point through the dry, sandy earth of the plaza, creating a deep, visible line in the dust that stretched across the open ground. He then raised his eyes, his voice trembling with a powerful mix of deep sorrow and unyielding aristocratic pride, and spoke directly to the hearts of the condemned. My brave companions, we are completely abandoned by our government, and we are surrounded by a ruthless army of thousands that intends to grant us absolutely no quarter under that blood-red flag. I have no more tactical orders to give you. I offer you only a final choice between two paths of honor. Those who are prepared to stand by me, refuse to surrender, and stay to die like true soldiers beneath the ruins of this fort, step across this line to my side. The emotional response to Travis's dramatic appeal was near instantaneous and deeply profound. The first individual to move was the young, battle-hardened volunteer Tapley Holland, who stepped resolutely across the line into the dust without a single moment of hesitation, shouting across the plaza that he was ready to die for the liberty of Texas. Within moments, a massive, collective wave of heavily armed men followed his example, their heavy leather boots trampling the earth as they rushed across the line in groups of 10s and 20s. The regular cavalrymen, the independent farmers from Gonzales, and the elite sharpshooters of the Tennessee Mounted Volunteers moved together as a singular, unified body of absolute revolutionary defiance. David Crockett walked across with his trusted rifle Old Betsy resting casually on his broad shoulder, his rugged face breaking into a calm, reassuring smile that instantly steadied the nerves of the younger teenagers standing nearby. Even the bedridden, physically broken Jim Bowie, who was currently lying on a canvas cot inside a dark, stone room in the low barracks, his lungs deeply congested with the final, agonizing stages of his advanced pulmonary disease, refused to be excluded from this definitive pact of blood. Hearing the roaring shouts of the men on the plaza, Bowie weakly raised his voice, calling out through the open doorway to his fellow volunteers, "Boys, I cannot physically walk across that line on my own feet, but I'll be damned if I am left behind on the wrong side of honor. Will a few of you kindly carry my cot across the line so I can stand with Travis?" 4 burly volunteers instantly rushed into his room, gently lifted the wooden frame of his bed, and carried the legendary knife fighter across the line into the dust, where Bowie proudly drew his heavy, custom-forged, silver-mounted Bowie knife from his belt, placing it flat across his chest as a silent sign that he would fight with his final, dying breath. Ultimately, out of the entire garrison, only a single individual, a veteran French soldier of fortune named Louis Moses Rose, who had survived the horrific horrors of Napoleon's catastrophic retreat from Moscow, chose to refuse the covenant of martyrdom. Rose quietly climbed over the low western wall in the dead of night, using his extensive survival skills to slip through the brush and escape into the open prairie, leaving his comrades behind to face their solitary, historic destiny. While the defenders inside the Alamo were solemnizing their tragic resolution, across the river in San Antonio, General Santa Anna was executing the final, cold-blooded organizational preparations for the physical annihilation of the fort. On the evening of March 4th, the dictator convened a high-level council of war with his senior generals and staff officers inside his central headquarters. Several of his highly experienced regular commanders, including General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon and Colonel Juan Almonte, forcefully argued for a brief, tactical delay of the final assault, pointing out that their heavy siege artillery train, consisting of massive, long-range iron cannons capable of completely reducing the Alamo walls to flat dust in a few hours, was scheduled to arrive on the frontier within less than 4 days. They explicitly argued that a premature infantry charge against the mounted Texian artillery would result in a massive, completely unnecessary loss of elite Mexican lives. Santa Anna, however, flatly, aggressively rejected their strategic caution with a display of cold, tyrannical arrogance that deeply shocked his staff. Driven by an intense desire to secure an absolute, spectacular military triumph before the incoming politicians of the Texan Convention could formally declare an independent republic, the dictator declared that the lives of his common conscripts were completely irrelevant to the grand glory of the Mexican state, cold-bloodedly stating to his generals, "What are the lives of soldiers? They are nothing but chickens whose sole purpose is to be sacrificed for the honor of the nation. I will launch the assault immediately, and I want no prisoners left alive to complicate our administration." He formally issued General Order No. 11, which systematically divided his massive force of over 2,000 elite regular infantrymen into 4 distinct, highly specialized assault columns, each equipped with heavy iron crowbars, thick scaling ladders, and broad axes, designed to simultaneously strike the Alamo from every single point of the compass in a synchronized, multi-directional wave of iron and steel. As the late night hours of March 5th crept across the lonely valley, a profound, eerie, and unnatural silence descended over the entire landscape of San Antonio. By explicit order of Santa Anna, the continuous, deafening roar of the Mexican bombardment suddenly ceased completely, plunging the dark plains into a deep, suffocating quietude that felt incredibly foreign to the hyper-vigilant senses of the defenders. Inside the Alamo, this unexpected termination of the artillery fire acted as a dangerous, fatal psychological trap. The exhausted Texian sentries, who had spent consecutive days under near-constant physical strain and sensory overload, found their eyelids growing irresistibly heavy under the soothing influence of the silence. One by one, the forward lookouts posted along the low northern trenches fell into a deep, paralyzed sleep of pure physical exhaustion, completely oblivious to the dark, terrifying movements unfolding in the shadows of the open prairie just beyond their lines. Out in the freezing darkness of the open fields, completely hidden beneath the thick ground fog of the early morning hours of March 6th, the massive centralist infantry columns were slowly, silently creeping into their final assault positions. The men were tightly packed together in vast, monolithic columns of gray and blue wool, their heavy breath pluming in the cold winter air as they clutched their heavy British-made Baker muskets with trembling hands. No campfires were permitted, no whispered conversations were allowed, and the regular officers walked the ranks with drawn swords, enforcing an absolute, terrifying silence under the strict penalty of immediate execution. They were positioned less than 300 yards from the sleeping fortress, waiting with an intense, breathless anticipation for the single, definitive signal that would unleash their collective, kinetic fury upon the low stone walls, turning the quiet Texas night into a roaring, blood-slick inferno of total urban slaughter. At precisely 5:30 a.m. on the freezing, pitch-black morning of March 6th, 1836, the agonizing, heavy silence that hung over the dark plains of San Antonio de Bexar was permanently, violently shattered into a million historical fragments. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, standing at his command post near the northern earthen batteries, raised his gloved hand and gave the definitive strategic signal to his massed battalions. Instantly, a solitary Mexican military bugler pierced the cold night air with the high, shrieking notes of the Degüello, followed immediately by the thunderous, collective roar of over 2,000 elite regular infantrymen who erupted from their hidden trenches, shouting their fierce national war cry, "Viva Santa Anna! Viva la República!" The dark fields surrounding the isolated 3-acre Alamo compound suddenly came alive with a massive, unstoppable sea of moving bodies, as the 4 specialized assault columns charged forward simultaneously from all points of the compass, their iron-tipped bayonets gleaming beneath the faint starlight. The sheer physical momentum of the centralist advance was terrifying in its mechanical efficiency. From the northwest, General Martin Perfecto de Cos led the Aldama battalion with an aggressive speed, while from the absolute north, Colonel Francisco Duque's massive Toluca column pushed directly toward the weakest, crumbling sector of the fortress, the low adobe walls of the northern cattle corral. The deep, heavy thrum of thousands of leather boots striking the frozen earth created a localized earthquake that vibrated directly through the stone structures of the old Franciscan mission. Despite the absolute surprise of the initial charge, the sleeping Texian garrison was shocked into a state of hyper-vigilant operational reality within less than a single minute. The forward sentries, having just discovered the massive dark columns emerging from the thick ground fog less than 100 yards away, fired their muskets into the darkness and ran frantically across the plaza, screaming the desperate, chilling alarm, "To the walls! Boys! The Mexicans are upon us! To the walls!" William Barrett Travis, who had been sleeping in his clothes on a crude wooden bunk inside his stone quarters in the low barracks, was the very first regular officer to respond to the crisis. He instantly grabbed his fine, polished officer's sword, strapped his double-barreled shotgun across his shoulder, and ran out onto the dark, smoke-filled plaza. With his red hair flying wildly in the freezing winter wind, Travis climbed the steep earthen ramp leading directly to the high northern platform, where the primary artillery battery was stationed. As he reached the top of the parapet, looking down into the dark abyss at the massive Toluca battalion rushing the ditch below, Travis raised his shotgun and fired both barrels directly into the tightly packed ranks of the enemy, shouting his final, immortal words of defiance to his gathered volunteers. "Come on, boys! The enemy is here! Give them hell! Victory or death!" The defensive response of the Texian garrison was swift, incredibly precise, and devastatingly lethal. Under the immediate direction of veteran artillery officers, the scattered cannons along the Alamo walls, including the massive 18-pounder Iron Giant at the southwestern apex, and the highly mobile brass field pieces mounted along the roofless stone church, were swung around, loaded to the absolute muzzle with lethal scrap metal, broken iron chains, and hundreds of lead canister balls. When the gunners applied their glowing linstocks to the touch holes, the fort exploded in a synchronized, blinding sheets of orange flame and earth-shattering noise. The massive concussive blasts ripped directly through the tightly packed frontal ranks of the Mexican columns, instantly vaporizing entire lines of infantrymen, scattering shattered bone, torn blue cloth, and broken metal across the blood-slick grass of the outer ditches. The physical carnage inflicted by the Texian artillery was so absolute and terrifying that the initial centralist momentum began to waver and stall. Colonel Francisco Duque, attempting to fiercely rally his breaking Toluca infantrymen at the foot of the northern wall, was struck directly in the thigh by a stray Texian musket ball and fell from his horse, where he was immediately, tragically trampled into the bloody mud by his own panicked, retreating soldiers. Seeing their commander fall and their closest comrades torn to pieces by the continuous canister fire, the common Mexican conscripts began to break formation, scattering blindly to the left and right to escape the lethal zone of fire. However, Santa Anna had anticipated this exact structural vulnerability. He immediately dispatched General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon to advance with the elite Zapadoras, a formidable unit of regular engineers, along with over 400 regular cavalrymen who formed a strict secondary line behind the infantry columns, explicitly ordering them to sabre or shoot any Mexican soldier who attempted to retreat or flee the field of battle. Driven by the unyielding fear of their own officers behind them and the burning pride of their regiments, the Mexican columns reformed under the cover of the thick, choking blankets of black gunpowder smoke that now hung low over the ditches. General Cos's northwestern column brilliantly shifted their strategic trajectory, pivoting away from the lethal direct fire of the western artillery platforms and concentrating their massive numbers against the base of the northern wall. Utilizing heavy iron crowbars and broad axes, the elite soldiers systematically began to hack away at the fragile, crumbling adobe bricks, while teams of infantrymen raised their thick wooden scaling ladders against the vertical stone ramparts, climbing upward through a continuous, blinding rain of Texian rifle fire and heavy rocks hurled down by the desperate defenders above. It was during this second, incredibly intense wave of the assault that the garrison suffered its first catastrophic leadership loss. William Barrett Travis, still standing proudly atop the exposed northern parapet, was actively reloading his weapon to fire a third time into the ascending masses when a single, high-velocity Mexican musket ball struck him directly in the center of his forehead. The 26-year-old commander's eyes rolled back, and he fell backward down the earthen ramp, his long sword slipping from his hand as his body came to a permanent, motionless rest beside the iron wheels of a cannon. Travis had achieved his long-sought historical immortality within the first 10 minutes of the battle, leaving the fractured defense of the northern sector without a centralized regular commander, just as the sheer numerical weight of the centralist army began to completely overwhelm the physical barriers of the fort. Simultaneously, along the southern and eastern perimeters, the tactical situation had degenerated into a terrifying, multi-directional struggle for sheer physical survival. The 3rd Mexican Column, commanded by Colonel José María Romero, had successfully advanced through the dense brush of the old peach orchards, placing their scaling ladders against the outer walls of the long barracks and the cattle corral. The legendary David Crockett and his small, elite band of 12 Tennessee sharpshooters were stationed primarily along the low wooden palisade wall that linked the stone church to the southern gatehouse, a sector that was incredibly exposed and lacked any permanent stone protection. Armed with multiple preloaded long rifles, Crockett and his men operated with a cool, mechanical precision that was nothing short of miraculous. Every single time a Mexican uniform appeared above the crest of the wooden timbers, a sharp crack from Old Betsy would instantly drop the soldier back into the dark ditch below, creating a mounting wall of fallen centralist bodies that effectively blocked the primary paths of the southern advance. However, the localized heroism of Crockett's Tennessee volunteers could not alter the brutal mathematical reality that was unfolding along the main northern wall. Driven forward by the continuous shouts of General Castrillon, a massive, unstoppable wave of Mexican infantrymen successfully crested the northern ramparts, using their superior numbers to completely overwhelm the few remaining Texian riflemen stationed at the outpost. Like a massive, broken dam releasing an iron ocean of blue uniforms, hundreds of elite centralist soldiers poured down from the northern parapets directly into the open plaza of the Alamo, their long bayonets fixed and their muskets firing blindly into the smoke-filled camp. The outer perimeter had officially collapsed, and the remaining, highly fragmented groups of Texian defenders finding themselves completely surrounded and exposed to a lethal crossfire on the open plaza, were forced to abandon their heavy artillery cannons and retreat frantically backward into the dark, stone rooms of the long barracks and the roofless sanctuary of the old church to make their final, desperate stand against the encroaching dark. The physical collapse of the Alamo's outer perimeter did not instantly signal the termination of the revolutionary resistance. Instead, it triggered an entirely new, profoundly horrific, and localized phase of close-quarter urban slaughter that unfolded within the pitch-black stone rooms of the long barracks and the unyielding sanctuary of the old church. As hundreds of elite Mexican centralist infantrymen flooded into the main plaza with their long steel bayonets fixed, the surviving Texian defenders executed a pre-planned, desperate defensive retreat, barricading themselves behind heavy oak doors, sandbag mounds, and stone partitions. The long barracks, a solid two-story limestone structure that had originally served as the quarters for Franciscan monks, became a labyrinthian fortress of individual, claustrophobic death traps. The Mexican soldiers were forced to systematically breach every single dark room one by one, utilizing heavy iron axes and captured Texian artillery pieces to violently smash through the thick wooden barriers. The combat inside these small, smoke-filled stone chambers was absolute, visceral, and unyielding in its primal ferocity. Because the cramped spaces rendered the long British-made Baker muskets highly unwieldy, the fighting rapidly degenerated into an ancestral chaos of clubbed rifles, flashing hunting knives, silver-mounted pistols, and bare human hands. The Texian volunteers, operating with the terrifying, kinetic energy of condemned men who fully realized that no quarter would be granted under the blood-red banner, fought for every square inch of the stone floor. When their weapons clicked empty, they swung the heavy walnut stocks of their rifles with enough physical force to shatter iron helmets, turning the narrow hallways into a slick, crimson mire of pulverized bone, torn blue wool, and stagnant gunpowder smoke. Every single room became an independent slaughterhouse, requiring the centralist battalions to pay a staggering, bloody price in human lives to secure a sequence of isolated, localized victories. It was within one of these dark, subterranean rooms in the low barracks that the legendary frontier knife fighter James Bowie met his tragic, highly dramatic historical destiny. For days, the formidable colonel had been entirely paralyzed and confined to a crude canvas cot, his massive physical frame utterly wasted by the advanced ravages of his acute pulmonary illness. However, as the splintering roar of axes smashed through his heavy oak door and the terrifying screams of the oncoming infantrymen filled the narrow corridor, Bowie's legendary fighting spirit experienced a sudden, final surge of pure adrenaline. Supported by thick pillows, he sat upright in his bed, clutching a pair of preloaded flintlock pistols in his trembling hands, while his famous, custom-forged, silver-mounted Bowie knife lay unsheathed across his heavy blanket. When the first wave of Mexican soldiers rushed through the shattered doorway with their bayonets lunging forward, Bowie fired his pistols with a cold, mechanical precision, instantly dropping the foremost infantrymen onto the blood-stained stone threshold. Even as multiple steel bayonets pierced his chest and shoulders, pinning his dying body back against the stone wall, the legendary frontiersman continued to slash blindly into the shadows with his massive knife, standard historical memory recording that he successfully took several more centralist soldiers down into the grave alongside him before his breathing permanently ceased. The iconic weapon that had defined his wild frontier legend was left buried deep within the chest of his final adversary, signaling the definitive, violent conclusion of one of the most larger-than-life figures in the turbulent history of the American West. Simultaneously, the ultimate structural redoubt of the garrison centered entirely around the roofless, scarred stone sanctuary of the old church at the southeastern apex of the compound. Within this sacred space, a tiny, fragmented band of fewer than 30 surviving Texian fighters, heavily reinforced by the legendary David Crockett and his remaining Tennessee Mounted Volunteers, prepared to execute their final, historic stand against the overwhelming Blue Tide. The young artillery officer Bonham, recognizing that their ammunition reserves were completely exhausted, ordered the final brass field pieces mounted on the high rear platform to be loaded with their very last handfuls of iron scrap metal and fired directly down into the main doorway of the church, vaporizing the initial wave of centralist shock troops who attempted to cross the threshold. However, the sheer numerical weight of Santa Anna's assault columns could not be stopped by isolated artillery blasts. Mexican infantrymen systematically climbed onto the high earthen ramps along the side walls, looking down into the roofless sanctuary from above and unleashing a continuous, lethal crossfire that systematically tore the remaining defenders to pieces. David Crockett, his signature raccoon skin cap lost in the chaos, and his rugged face heavily encrusted with black soot and blood, fought with the unyielding composure of a natural-born icon. When his trusted rifle Old Betsy was shattered by a stray musket ball, Crockett used the heavy iron barrel as a massive club, swinging it with a desperate, terrifying force to hold off a dozen surrounding infantrymen. According to the detailed historical journal entries of Mexican Staff Officer Lieutenant José Enrique de la Peña, Crockett and a small handful of 5 other severely wounded survivors were eventually surrounded, disarmed, and brought before General Santa Anna himself by General Castrillon, who begged the dictator to spare their lives as honorable prisoners of war. Santa Anna, however, looked upon the bleeding, unbroken American frontiersmen with a cold, tyrannical contempt, and reacted with a display of absolute, calculated cruelty. He furiously reprimanded Castrillon for violating his explicit standing orders regarding the total extermination of the rebels, turned to his personal staff officers, and ordered them to execute the prisoners immediately. Instantly, several young sub-lieutenants drew their polished swords and plunged them repeatedly into Crockett's chest, killing the famous former United States congressman on the dirt floor of the main plaza beneath the cold morning sun. By 6:30 a.m., after precisely 60 minutes of concentrated, apocalyptic warfare, the definitive silence of the grave settled over the ruins of the Alamo. Every single one of the roughly 189 armed defenders lay dead, their motionless bodies scattered across the plazas, rooms, and platforms like a broken monument to an unyielding ideological defiance. The immediate aftermath of the battle was marked by a horrific, multi-day scene of systematic desecration and logistical cleanup directed personally by the victorious dictator. Santa Anna flatly refused to grant the fallen Texian defenders the basic dignity of a traditional military burial or a sacred Christian interment. Instead, he ordered his regular town laborers to gather the bloody, mangled corpses of Travis, Bowie, Crockett, and all their followers, cart them to an open field near the Alameda, and stack them into 3 massive, alternating layers of dry oak, wood, and human flesh. These monumental funeral pyres were set ablaze late that afternoon, sending a thick, greasy column of black, foul-smelling smoke billowing into the Texas sky. A terrifying visual warning designed to signal to the remaining Anglo colonies that the centralist dictatorship would completely incinerate any individual who dared to challenge the absolute sovereignty of the Mexican state. Yet, in his absolute, arrogant blindness to the fundamental mechanics of human psychology and democratic resilience, Santa Anna had unknowingly committed a fatal, catastrophic strategic error. The brutal, unyielding martyrdom of the Alamo defenders did not break the spine of the Texan Revolution. It acted as a massive, world-altering spiritual catalyst that instantly unified the fractured political factions and transformed a disorganized regional rebellion into a fierce, fanatical crusade for absolute independence. The tragic, immortal letters penned by William Barrett Travis were printed in newspapers across the United States, triggering a massive, unprecedented wave of emotional outrage, patriotic fervor, and logistical support that saw thousands of fresh, heavily armed American volunteers pack their bags and march westward to join the ranks of Sam Houston's retreating army. The epic narrative of the Alamo would achieve its ultimate, lightning-fast historical vindication less than 7 weeks later on the sun-drenched, swampy plains of San Jacinto. On the fateful afternoon of April 21st, 1836, an inspired, bloodthirsty Texian army of under 900 men, under the singular command of General Sam Houston, executed a brilliant, high-speed surprise assault against Santa Anna's overconfident, sleeping regular vanguard division. As the Texian cavalry smashed through the central Mexican lines, the infantrymen rushed forward with their bayonets lowered, their voices merging into a single, terrifying, and earth-shattering battle cry that echoed across the marshes. "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" Within less than 18 minutes of pure, unadulterated retributive slaughter, the elite Mexican division was completely destroyed. Over 600 Centralist soldiers were killed, and the Napoleon of the West, General Santa Anna himself, was captured in the high grass while dressed in a common private's uniform, forced under the threat of immediate hanging to sign the historic treaties that permanently recognized the independent sovereign independence of the Republic of Texas, forever altering the political cartography of the North American continent. The spectacular, lightning-fast Texian triumph at San Jacinto and the humiliating capture of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna did not instantly inaugurate an era of tranquil peace and stable prosperity for the newly proclaimed Republic of Texas. Although the treaties of Velasco, signed by a terrified, captive Santa Anna in May 1836, formally mandated the absolute withdrawal of all Mexican Centralist forces south of the Rio Grande, the National Congress in Mexico City explicitly and repeatedly repudiated the validity of the agreements. The Mexican government argued with absolute diplomatic vehemence that a treaty signed under the immediate physical duress of military captivity possessed zero constitutional legitimacy, officially maintaining that Coahuila y Tejas remained a rebellious, sovereign province of the Mexican Republic that must be eventually, systematically reconquered by the iron power of the state. Consequently, the young Republic of Texas found itself thrust into a highly volatile, decade-long geopolitical crucible, suspended in a state of continuous, unrecognized Cold War that threatened its physical survival at every turn. For the young Lone Star Republic, the immediate post-revolutionary years were characterized by severe, near-fatal financial instability, intense internal political factionalism, and continuous, bloody frontier warfare against the powerful, highly organized Comanche and Kiowa nations who flatly refused to recognize Anglo-territorial claims. The national treasury was completely bankrupt, burdened by a staggering revolutionary debt that rapidly rendered the republic's paper currency, popularly known as star money and redbacks, practically worthless in international commercial markets. Structurally, the nation's political landscape was deeply fractured between two irreconcilable strategic visions represented by its first two constitutional presidents, Sam Houston and Mirabeau B. Lamar. Houston, operating with a cool, long-term pragmatic realism, consistently advocated for a policy of severe fiscal austerity, peaceful diplomatic coexistence with both the Native American tribes and the Mexican government, and an aggressive, single-minded pursuit of immediate annexation by the United States. In stark, absolute contrast, Mirabeau B. Lamar possessed a highly romanticized, intensely nationalistic vision of an independent, transcontinental Texan empire that would rival the United States in wealth and geographic scale. Lamar systematically expanded the national debt to construct a formidable blue water navy, aggressively relocated the national capital to the exposed western frontier settlement of Austin, and launched an expansive, disastrous military and commercial expedition towards Santa Fe in 1841 in a failed attempt to forcibly annex the lucrative trade routes of New Mexico. This aggressive foreign policy only succeeded in provoking a series of rapid, retaliatory military invasions from the Mexican Regular Army. In 1842, professional Mexican columns under the expert command of General Rafael Vasquez and General Adrian Wool twice crossed the Rio Grande, swept across the open plains, and successfully captured San Antonio de Bexar, briefly raising the Mexican tricolor flag over the public squares before withdrawing back across the border, proving with absolute clarity that Texas remained structurally incapable of securing its own borders without foreign intervention. This continuous, highly dangerous state of existential vulnerability permanently resolved the internal debate regarding Texas's ultimate geopolitical destiny, transforming the sovereign republic into the primary explosive catalyst for the massive territorial expansion of the United States. In December 1845, after years of intense, highly controversial national debates over the moral and political implications of admitting a massive slave continental territory into the Union, the United States Congress formally approved the joint resolution of annexation, officially transforming Texas into the 28th state of the American Republic. This historic domestic political maneuver was viewed by the government in Mexico City as an explicit, undeniable act of international aggression and an absolute declaration of war. The newly elected American president, James K. Polk, a fierce, uncompromising believer in the ideological doctrine of manifest destiny, which asserted that the United States possessed a divine, providential right to span the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, immediately deployed a large regular observation force under General Zachary Taylor to cross the Nueces River and establish an armed encampment directly along the northern banks of the Rio Grande. The inevitable, violent collision between the two highly nationalistic republics was officially ignited in April 1846 in the dense chaparral fields near the Rio Grande, during a skirmish known to history as the Thornton Affair, where Mexican cavalry elements successfully surrounded and attacked an American patrol. Utilizing this localized engagement as the necessary political justification, President Polk famously declared to Congress that Mexico had crossed the boundary of the United States, shed American blood upon American soil, and officially initiated the Mexican-American War. This vast, 2-year continental conflict served as the ultimate, destructive culmination of the ideological struggle that had begun inside the walls of the Alamo a decade prior. For the thousands of American regular soldiers and volunteers who marched southward into the heart of Mexico, including veteran Texian Rangers and officers who would later dominate the American Civil War, the memory of the 1836 slaughterhouse operated as a fierce, fanatical, psychological fuel. Battle-hardened units repeatedly charged into the heavy fortifications of Monterrey, Buena Vista, Cerro Gordo, and Chapultepec, while screaming the terrifying, retributive battle cry, "Remember the Alamo!" The military conflict concluded in February 1848 with the signing of the monumental Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, an international agreement that shattered the territorial cartography of North America forever. Under the harsh terms of this treaty, a completely defeated Mexico was forced to formally cede more than 55% of its sovereign national territory to the United States in exchange for a modest financial payment of $15 million. This massive territorial acquisition, popularly known as the Mexican Cession, encompassed the modern states of California, Nevada, Utah, the vast majority of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, instantly transforming the United States into a colossus-like transcontinental global superpower while permanently plunging the Mexican Republic into a multi-generational era of severe political instability, profound national humiliation, and devastating civil conflicts. while the grand, macro-political map of North America was being forcefully redrawn by the iron machinery of war, the physical site of the Alamo itself underwent a long, highly turbulent transformation from an abandoned, blood-stained military ruin into the ultimate, sacrosanct shrine of Texas identity and global historical tourism. In the immediate decades following the 1836 battle, the crumbling stone compound was largely ignored by local administrators, serving temporarily as a commercial outpost, a livery stable, and a storage depot for the United States Army Quartermaster Corps. It was during this military occupation in the late 1840s that regular Army architects executed a critical, highly iconic structural modification. To mask the broken, roofless top of the old limestone church, engineers constructed a prominent, curved parapet or hump atop the historical facade, creating the unique, universally recognized architectural silhouette that defines the visual image of the Alamo in the global modern consciousness. The systematic preservation of the site as a sacred historical monument was achieved in the early 20th century through a fierce, highly publicized intellectual and political struggle known locally as the Second Battle of the Alamo, spearheaded by the dedicated women of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, most notably Adina de Zavala and Clara Driscoll. These visionary preservationists spent decades acquiring individual land titles, fighting off commercial developers who desired to construct massive modern hotels over the historic plaza, and systematically restoring the remaining structures of the long barracks and the church sanctuary. Today, the Alamo stands as a silent, deeply reverent limestone monument positioned directly in the vibrant, bustling heart of modern downtown San Antonio, attracting millions of international visitors each year who enter its cool, stone corridors in absolute silence to gaze upon the brass plaques that mark the approximate locations where William Barrett Travis, James Bowie, and David Crockett surrendered their lives to history. Ultimately, the epic, multi-generational saga of the Alamo transcends the narrow boundaries of a localized frontier engagement, standing as an eternal, highly complex monument to the absolute limits of human endurance, the terrifying cost of imperial ambition, and the unyielding power of historical myth-making. The 189 defenders who stood atop the crumbling adobe walls in the freezing dawn of March 6, 1836, fully realizing that their lives were forfeit under the crimson flag of no quarter, did not simply hold a military position. They knowingly, purposefully transformed their deaths into a powerful, multi-generational narrative of liberty that continues to echo through the literature, cinema, and political identity of the modern world, serving as an unbroken, eternal reminder of the extraordinary, tragic ways in which ordinary, fallible human beings choose to define themselves when all hope of survival has been completely stripped away. The physical silencing of the artillery pieces on the Texas frontier and the structural consolidation of the American transcontinental empire did not mark the end of the narrative of the Alamo. Instead, it initiated a multi-generational, highly industrial process of cultural myth-making that would permanently extract the historical figures of Travis, Bowie, and Crockett from the messy reality of the 19th century and deposit them into the sacrosanct realm of global folklore. Over the course of the late 19th and entire 20th centuries, the tragic 60-minute military defense of the old San Antonio de Valero mission underwent a radical, highly calculated ideological reconstruction. The complex, fluid political realities of the 1836 rebellion, which had been fought by a highly diverse collection of Anglo-American immigrants, European adventurers, and native Mexican federalists over constitutional rights and land speculation, were systematically distilled into a simplistic, monolithic, cultural epic of Western civilization. It became the ultimate cinematic parable of absolute good versus absolute evil, of Anglo-democratic freedom actively resisting the tyrannical, Eastern-style despotism of a military dictatorship, establishing a cultural template that would deeply influence the global projection of American identity for over a century. This industrialization of memory was driven initially by the proliferation of late 19th century American popular literature, dime novels, and traveling frontier shows that sought to satisfy an insatiable public hunger for romanticized masculine heroism. The real, deeply fallible human beings who had died within the Adobe Fortress were systematically stripped of their historical contradictions, financial debts, and problematic socio-political ties to chattel slavery. William Barrett Travis was elevated from a deeply troubled, debt-ridden young lawyer fleeing a failed marriage into the ultimate, flawless archetype of classical military virtue and tragic aristocratic romanticism. James Bowie, whose historical career had been deeply defined by illegal slave-trading partnerships with pirates like Jean Lafitte and highly fraudulent land speculations in Monclova, was thoroughly cleansed of his underworld associations, transformed instead into the noble, rugged personification of frontier justice and raw, individualistic physical strength whose legendary knife served as an extension of democratic law on the wild borderlands. However, the ultimate, most powerful vehicle for this cultural transmutation was the meteoric rise of the American cinematic apparatus in the 20th century, which transformed the Alamo into a global visual shorthand for unyielding collective sacrifice. The legendary David Crockett served as the primary nexus for this mass media transformation. In the mid-1950s, the visionary entertainment mogul Walt Disney launched a multi-part television miniseries titled Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, starring the charismatic actor Fess Parker. The cultural impact of this single media broadcast was an unprecedented, near-apocalyptic phenomenon in the history of global consumer capitalism. Millions of children across the United States, Europe, and Asia became instantly obsessed with the romanticized image of the American frontier, resulting in the mass production of millions of replica coonskin caps, toy long rifles, and patriotic frontier buckskins. The historical Crockett, a highly complex, cynical professional politician who had spent years fighting President Andrew Jackson's brutal Indian removal policies in Congress before traveling to Texas to salvage his ruined financial career, was permanently overwritten in the global public consciousness by Disney's clean-cut, deeply moral pioneer hero who chose to sacrifice his life at the Alamo purely, out of an abstract, unyielding devotion to the divine concept of human liberty. This cinematic myth-making reached its absolute, monumental apex in 1960 with the release of the massive, multi-million-dollar Hollywood epic The Alamo, produced, directed, and starred by the iconic personification of American cinematic masculinity, John Wayne. Operating at the absolute height of the global Cold War, John Wayne intentionally and explicitly weaponized the historical narrative of the 1836 siege to deliver a powerful, highly simplistic geopolitical message aimed directly at contemporary global audiences. In Wayne's epic vision, the crumbling stone walls of the Texas mission were explicitly transformed into a metaphorical ideological fortress resisting the encroaching darkness of global totalitarianism. The film completely disregarded the intricate historical timeline and the strategic contributions of the regular army units, choosing instead to focus entirely on a deeply philosophical, highly idealized dialogue regarding the spiritual necessity of individual freedom and military self-sacrifice. The movie's grand, highly dramatic musical score, composed by Dmitri Tiomkin, along with its massive, spectacular recreation of the final centralist assault, permanently cemented the cinematic image of the Alamo as the ultimate global symbol of a heroic last stand, ensuring that generations of international audiences would view the history of the conflict through the highly specific, romanticized lens of mid-century Hollywood patriotism. Simultaneously, Beneath the heavy, glittering blankets of this industrial myth-making, modern academic historians, archaeologists, and cultural critics began to execute a rigorous, highly controversial deconstruction of the traditional Alamo narrative, sparking an intense, ongoing cultural conflict known popularly as the Third Battle of the Alamo. Beginning in the late 20th century and extending deep into the modern era, revisionist scholarship began to systematically strip away the layers of Hollywood fiction to expose the deep, highly problematic structural contradictions that lay at the absolute core of the 1835 revolution. Chief among these critical interventions was the formal, public reintegration of the institution of chattel slavery into the grand historical narrative of the conflict. Modern historical research demonstrated with absolute, undeniable clarity that one of the primary, unstated motivations driving the Anglo-American Texian colonists to rebel against Mexico City was Santa Anna's explicit, aggressive determination to enforce the national abolition of slavery across the entire Mexican Republic. For the southern cotton planters who dominated the colonial settlements of Coahuila y Tejas, the centralist dictatorship represented an immediate, existential threat to their massive financial investments in enslaved human labor, revealing that the abstract rhetoric of liberty and freedom utilized by the revolutionaries coexisted paradoxically with a fierce determination to preserve a brutal system of racialized human bondage. Furthermore, modern critical history has brilliantly and painstakingly restored the long-suppressed, highly critical contributions of the native Tejano populations to the revolutionary struggle, dismantling the outdated, deeply problematic racial dichotomy that had long characterized traditional Texan myth-making. Historians have demonstrated that prominent Tejano leaders like Juan Seguin, José Antonio Navarro, and the elite cavalrymen who rode into battle under their command were not mere peripheral assistants to the Anglo settlers. They were the original, highly articulate ideological architects of the Federalist resistance against Santa Anna's centralization. These native Tejanos viewed the dictatorial destruction of the Constitution of 1824 through a deeply personal, tragic lens, recognizing that their own ancestral lands, civil rights, and cultural autonomy were being systematically crushed by the military machinery of Mexico City. By actively participating in the defense of San Antonio and riding as couriers through the lethal siege lines of the Alamo, these Tejano patriots proved that the revolutionary struggle was a highly complex, multi-ethnic civil war for regional self-governance rather than a simplistic, racialized conflict between two completely separate biological cultures. The modern physical reality of the Alamo compound reflects this profound, continuous tension between the preservation of a sacred, romanticized national myth and the strict, unyielding demands of objective historical accuracy. As the city of San Antonio has expanded into a massive, multi-ethnic modern metropolis, a massive, multi-million-dollar urban redesign project has been initiated to completely restructure the historic plaza surrounding the limestone mission. Modern museum planners and cultural resource management teams are working extensively to remove the 20th century commercial businesses from the immediate vicinity of the walls, systematically excavating the long-buried footprint of the original outer palisades and the northern trenches, and constructing advanced educational facilities designed to present a highly nuanced, completely inclusive history of the site. This modern interpretation aims to tell the comprehensive story of the Alamo, not merely as a 90-minute military clash between two armies in 1836, but as a multi-layered historic space that encompasses thousands of years of indigenous Native American occupation, a century of Spanish colonial missionary work, a violent theater of Mexican independence, and a continuous, living laboratory of global memory. Ultimately, the enduring, global fascination with the Alamo lies not in its tactical significance as an isolated 19th century military engagement, but in its unique, near miraculous capacity to continuously reflect the shifting moral, political, and cultural anxieties of the generations that look upon its stones. It remains the absolute, supreme monument to the universal human condition when confronted with the terrifying reality of absolute, predetermined mortality. Whether viewed as a flawless temple of pure patriotic liberty, a tragic symbol of 19th century imperial expansion, or a complex monument to the historical contradictions of the American frontier, the silent limestone facade with its iconic curved parapet continues to stand defiantly amidst the glass towers of the modern world, an eternal, unbroken mirror ensuring that as long as human civilizations continue to grapple with the profound concepts of honor, duty, and the ultimate cost of individual sacrifice, the world will never, under any circumstances, forget the tragic, immortal narrative of the fight for the Alamo. The epic historiography of the Alamo is inherently incomplete if it is measured solely through the strategic maneuvers of commanding generals or the sweeping geopolitical transformations of continental empires. Its true, visceral human reality resides within the long-suppressed, highly poignant personal narratives of the non-combatants, the enslaved individuals, and the civilian survivors who experienced the absolute horrors of the March 6th slaughterhouse from within the shadow of the limestone walls. When General Santa Anna issued his absolute decree of no quarter, he explicitly dictated that every single armed rebel caught within the complex must be put to the iron sword. However, operating with a calculated, highly political sense of 19th century patriarchal mercy, the dictator granted absolute immunity to the small handful of innocent women, young children, and enslaved domestic servants who had huddled in terror inside the dark, sulphurous rooms of the old stone church during the final, apocalyptic infantry assault. These traumatized survivors were transformed by history into the ultimate, living conduits of memory, their subsequent eyewitness testimonies serving as the foundational bedrock upon which the entire emotional legacy of the Texas Revolution would be permanently constructed. Chief among these critical, yet long marginalized historical witnesses was a 23-year-old enslaved African-American man known to history simply as Joe. Joe was the personal chattel property of William Barrett Travis, having been forced to accompany the young aristocratic commander to the exposed frontier outpost to perform heavy manual labor and domestic cooking duties for the regular army officers. On the fateful morning of the final charge, Joe had run onto the high northern parapet alongside Travis, clutching a loaded musket and witnessing firsthand the exact moment the high-velocity Mexican bullet struck his master in the forehead. Following Travis's immediate death, Joe retreated frantically into the dark recesses of the low barracks, barricading himself inside a small room and firing his weapon into the advancing blue columns until the chamber was completely overwhelmed by Centralist infantrymen. Despite being aggressively struck with a regular steel bayonet and suffering a painful flesh wound from a stray musket ball, Joe's life was miraculously spared by a senior Mexican officer who recognized his status as an enslaved non-combatant. 2 weeks after the battle, Joe was brought directly before the Provisional Texan Cabinet in Washington on the Brazos, where he delivered the very first comprehensive, highly detailed military briefing regarding the final hours of the garrison. His calm, deeply articulate description of Travis's unyielding defiance, the overwhelming numerical weight of the Centralist columns, and the terrifying efficiency of the Texian artillery provided the desperate revolutionary leaders with their first factual confirmation of the disaster, transforming Joe from a forgotten victim of institutional human bondage into one of the most vital, sacrosanct chroniclers of early American frontier liberty. Equally central to the emotional architecture of the Alamo legend was the harrowing, multi-generational experience of Susanna Dickinson, the 21-year-old wife of the regular Texian artillery captain Almiron Dickinson. Susanna, along with her infant daughter Angelina, who would later be affectionately romanticized across the American continent as the Babe of the Alamo, had spent the final days of the 12-day siege cloaked in near absolute darkness inside a tiny, vaulted room located at the rear of the roofless stone church. Throughout the entire 60-minute morning assault, the young mother sat paralyzed with terror as the earth-shattering roar of heavy cannons exploded directly overhead, the thick sheets of black gunpowder smoke pouring through the narrow stone windows until the air became almost entirely unbreathable. She listened with an agonizing clarity as her husband ran into the room, kissed his daughter a final time, shouted that all was lost, and rushed back out into the smoky sanctuary with his sword drawn to be immediately vaporized by a volley of Mexican bayonets. Following the total cessation of the fighting, a blood-soaked Mexican soldier entered her dark hiding place and escorted Susanna across the main plaza, forcing her to walk past the mangled, unrecognizable corpses of her husband and closest friends, which were already being systematically stacked into monumental funeral pyres by local laborers. She was brought directly into the private, opulent headquarters of General Santa Anna, where the victorious dictator executed a complex display of theatrical magnanimity. Deeply struck by the innocence of the infant Angelina, Santa Anna formally offered to adopt the child, promising to take her to Mexico City to be raised within the absolute highest aristocratic circles of Mexican society and educated at the direct expense of the state. Susanna flatly, fiercely refused the dictator's offer, choosing instead to accept a small traveling stipend and a horse, explicitly tasked by Santa Anna to ride eastward to the settlement of Gonzales to deliver a chilling, first-hand verbal warning to General Sam Houston regarding the absolute futility of any further armed resistance against the professional might of the Army of Operations. The historical impact of Susanna Dickinson's sudden, exhausted arrival in Gonzales on the afternoon of March 13, 1836, was an unprecedented, near-apocalyptic psychological phenomenon that redefined the entire course of the revolution. As the young widow, dressed in torn, soot-stained clothes and carrying her infant daughter, collapsed into the arms of the local citizens, her raw, breathless description of the absolute annihilation of the Alamo garrison and the impending advance of Santa Anna's massive columns triggered a wave of pure, unadulterated terror that swept across the entire Anglo-American colonial frontier. This collective psychological collapse initiated a massive, historic civil evacuation known to Texas history as the Runaway Scrape. Thousands of panicked families systematically abandoned their farms, burned their own homes to the ground to deny supplies to the enemy, and fled frantically eastward toward the safety of the Sabine River under torrential rainstorms, turning the Texas wilderness into a vast, muddy highway of human misery that pushed the revolutionary cause to the absolute brink of total physical extinction. Yet, as the decades have slowly accumulated over the limestone ruins of San Antonio, the ultimate historical vindication of the Alamo has shifted away from the macro-political narratives of national expansion, focusing instead on a deeply spiritual reverence for the individual, anonymous sacrifices that unfolded within the fort. Modern historical memory has increasingly sought to honor the diverse, cross-cultural tapestry of ordinary human beings who chose to stand by Travis when the line was drawn in the dust. History now records the names of individuals like Gregorio Esparza, a native Tejano volunteer who brought his wife and 4 children into the fort, choosing to turn his artillery cannon against Santa Anna's centralist forces to protect his ancestral homeland, his body later being the only Texian corpse granted a Christian burial due to his brother serving as a loyal officer in the Mexican regular vanguard. Similarly, memory now honors the young European immigrants like Louis Daniel William, a native of England, and the dozens of idealistic young men from Germany, Ireland, and Scotland who had only recently arrived on the shores of the North American continent, yet chose to surrender their lives inside a remote, crumbling Spanish mission for an abstract concept of regional autonomy they had only recently encountered. The collective legacy of these diverse individuals has systematically transformed the Alamo into an eternal, living symbol of an unbroken global vigil. It remains the supreme historical proof that the ultimate measure of human greatness is found not in the guaranteed certainty of an easy military victory, but in the deliberate, self-conscious decision of ordinary, fallible human beings to stand shoulder to shoulder in the face of an absolute, encroaching darkness, choosing to write their final testament in blood upon the pages of time so that the ideals of liberty might continue to burn as an unyielding, eternal beacon for the generations that have yet to be born. To fully elevate the narrative of the Alamo from a romanticized cultural fable into a rigorous, academic case study of 19th century siege warfare, one must execute a precise, highly clinical operational and ballistic analysis of the tactical architecture, military technologies, and strategic command decisions that dictated the physical parameters of the conflict. The 60-minute apocalypse that unfolded on the morning of March 6, 1836, was not merely a spontaneous clash of raw human wills. It was the direct, predictable outcome of a profound asymmetry in military doctrine, engineering capabilities, and logistical infrastructure between a professional, European-style national army and an ad hoc, highly undisciplined citizen militia. By dissecting the structural vulnerabilities of the San Antonio de Valero mission and analyzing the stark ballistics of the small arms and heavy artillery utilized by both factions, modern military theorists can reconstruct the precise mechanical sequence that rendered the catastrophic fall of the fortress a mathematical certainty from the very inception of the centralist blockade. The physical blueprint of the Alamo itself represented the primary, near insurmountable tactical crisis for the joint command of William Barrett Travis and James Bowie. Architecturally, the compound was never engineered to operate as a cohesive military bastion capable of withstanding a concentrated, multi-directional infantry assault supported by professional siege artillery. It was a sprawling, highly irregular 3-acre religious enclosure characterized by extensive structural fragmentation. The defensive perimeter stretched over a quarter of a mile, requiring a minimum force of 1,000 highly trained regular infantrymen to adequately man every parapet, secure every gatehouse, and maintain a continuous, overlapping field of protective crossfire. With a total fighting strength that never exceeded 189 effective combatants, Travis's men were fundamentally incapable of maintaining a sufficient physical density along the ramparts. This operational vacuum left vast, critical sectors of the low adobe walls completely undefended, allowing the massive centralist columns to approach the base of the fortifications without encountering a uniform, continuous line of defensive lead. Furthermore, the structural composition of the walls themselves was highly fragile, consisting predominantly of century-old, sun-dried adobe bricks and unreinforced limestone plaster that had been heavily degraded by decades of exposure to the elements and regional conflicts. Under the brilliant engineering direction of Colonel James C. Neal and regular Army engineer Jameson, the defenders had attempted to perform a series of rapid, ad hoc modifications to adapt the decaying mission structures for modern heavy artillery defense. They constructed massive earthen ramps and elevated wooden platforms, known as terraplenes, inside the roofless church and along the interior plazas to allow their heavy iron and brass cannons to fire over the high stone parapets. However, these improvisations created their own severe tactical vulnerabilities. The immense concussive recoil generated by firing heavy pieces like the massive 18-pounder Iron Giant at the southwestern apex placed an extreme mechanical strain on the unstable wooden scaffolding, threatening to completely collapse the platforms beneath the feet of the gunners and requiring constant, exhausting physical maintenance under the continuous rain of Mexican centralist field fire. The ballistic disparities between the small arms carried by the opposing forces presented an equally complex, highly paradoxical tactical dynamic on the battlefield. The vast majority of the Texian volunteers and independent adventurous fighters were equipped with civilian frontier hunting weapons, most notably the legendary American long rifle, a long-barreled, flintlock firearm characterized by a precisely rifled interior barrel that fired a tight-fitting lead ball. In the hands of the highly experienced sharpshooters of the Tennessee Mounted Volunteers and seasoned frontier hunters, these long rifles were instruments of terrifying, pinpoint lethality, capable of systematically striking individual human targets at extended distances of over 250 to 300 yards. This extended range allowed the defenders to pick off Mexican regular officers and artillery crewmen with incredible efficiency during the early days of the blockade, forcing Santa Anna's engineers to construct their zigzagging trenches under a state of continuous, hyper-vigilant psychological terror. However, when the conflict shifted from a long-range siege into a high-speed, mass infantry night assault, the ballistic advantages of the American long rifle completely evaporated, converting into a fatal structural liability. The long rifle was an incredibly slow, mechanically meticulous weapon to reload, requiring the marksman to carefully measure black powder from a horn, wrap the lead ball in a greased leather patch, and forcefully ram the projectile down the tight spiral grooves of the long barrel with a wooden ramrod. A complex, fine motor process that required anywhere from 30 to 45 seconds to complete, under intense combat stress. Furthermore, these civilian hunting weapons lacked any standardized mechanism for attaching a steel bayonet. Once a long rifle was fired, the defender was left entirely defenseless against a close-quarter charge, forced to utilize his firearm as a clumsy, crude wooden club, or rely entirely on his hunting knives and pistols against a wall of incoming steel. In absolute structural contrast, General Santa Anna's regular infantry battalions were uniformly equipped with the standard British-made East India pattern Brown Bess musket, a heavy, smoothbore firearm that represented the absolute pinnacle of European mass infantry military doctrine. The Brown Bess fired a massive, loose-fitting .75 caliber lead ball through a smooth interior barrel, a design that rendered the weapon notoriously inaccurate at distances beyond 75 to 100 yards. However, the loose fit of the ammunition allowed a well-trained, professional Mexican regular conscript to reload his weapon with an incredible mechanical speed, consistently firing 3 to 4 rounds per minute using prepackaged paper cartridges. Crucially, every single Brown Bess musket was equipped with a massive 17-inch triangular steel bayonet that locked securely onto the muzzle of the barrel. When the centralist columns successfully breached the low northern walls and poured into the dark, smoke-filled plazas of the Alamo, their muskets were instantly transformed into deadly, uniform pikes, allowing them to advance in dense, highly coordinated formations of solid steel that easily impaled and crushed the isolated, uncoordinated Texian fighters who were trapped inside the open spaces without bayonets or uniform armor. From a clinical, objective standpoint of modern military science, the strategic and tactical post-mortem of the defense reveals a series of critical, near-fatal command miscalculations executed by William Barrett Travis during his brief tenure as Supreme Regular Commander. Chief among these operational failures was his complete, systematic neglect of early combat intelligence and frontier scouting reports. Travis remained so deeply wedded to his idealized, romantic preconceptions regarding the absolute impossibility of a winter offensive by the Mexican army that he failed to establish an effective network of long-range cavalry scouts along the primary southern approach routes from Laredo. This intelligence vacuum allowed Santa Anna's vanguard cavalry elements to catch the garrison in a state of absolute strategic surprise on February 23rd, forcing the defenders to execute a frantic, chaotic retreat into an indefensible mission compound without their full complement of horses, gunpowder reserves, or external logistical lines. Additionally, Travis's defensive doctrine was heavily compromised by his stubborn, highly rigid refusal to execute a timely tactical withdrawal when it became mathematically undeniable that no massive relief column was coming to save the fort. By choosing to explicitly ignore General Sam Houston's original, highly pragmatic orders to dismantle the heavy artillery, explode the deep powder magazines, and abandon San Antonio to establish a secure front behind the Guadalupe River, Travis committed his men to a solitary, static defense that possessed zero long-term strategic utility for the wider revolution. The total annihilation of the 189 experienced frontier fighters inside the Alamo represented a catastrophic drain of invaluable military manpower that nearly cost Texas its independence, proving that while Travis's uncompromising victory or death philosophy achieved an immortal, global romantic resonance, it simultaneously represented a deeply flawed, highly dangerous failure of rational military command that was only redeemed by the absolute, near-miraculous tactical blunders executed by Santa Anna weeks later on the marshes of San Jacinto. The total cessation of physical hostilities on the Texas frontier did not permanently seal the historical ledger of the Alamo. Instead, it initiated a multi-generational, deeply philosophical process of historical reflection that continues to challenge, inspire, and divide modern societies. When the last embers of the monumental funeral pyres finally grew cold beneath the San Antonio sky in March 1836, the physical remains of the 189 defenders merged permanently with the dry soil of the frontier. Yet, the narrative generated by their collective sacrifice achieved a form of structural immortality, rapidly expanding beyond the immediate geopolitical boundaries of the 19th century to become a foundational epic of the global modern world. The Alamo ceased to operate merely as a geographical location or a crumbling limestone ruin. It was transformed into a universal psychological landscape, where the profound concepts of duty, ideological defiance, and the ultimate cost of human liberty are continuously debated, reinterpreted, and weaponized across the generations. To fully comprehend the ultimate, long-term historical legacy of this 60-minute military apocalypse, one must critically analyze the starkly divergent socio-political trajectories experienced by the two primary nations that emerged from its bloody crucible. For the Republic of Mexico, the catastrophic territorial loss initiated by the Texan Revolution and completed by the devastating Mexican-American War acted as a profound, multi-generational trauma that severely fractured the developing national identity. The systematic extraction of over half of the nation's sovereign territory under the harsh dictatorial terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did not merely represent a loss of physical land, mineral wealth, and agricultural infrastructure. It permanently destabilized the political stability of the young republic, throwing the nation into a catastrophic cycle of fierce civil wars, foreign French interventions, and prolonged military dictatorships. In the historical memory of Mexico, the Alamo and the subsequent campaigns are viewed through a deeply sober, highly critical lens, not as a heroic defense of abstract liberty, but as a calculated, illegal act of aggressive foreign filibustering and territorial expansion orchestrated by Anglo-American land speculators who systematically violated Mexican constitutional law, broken their solemn oath of citizenship, and forcefully reintroduced the brutal institution of human chattel slavery to a sovereign soil that had explicitly abolished it. This critical counter-narrative serves as a powerful, necessary intellectual reminder that the grand rhetoric of historical memory is inherently dependent upon the political perspective of those who hold the pen, revealing that the very same limestone walls that symbolize a sacred temple of freedom for one culture can simultaneously represent a tragic monument to imperial aggression and national fragmentation for another. Conversely, for the United States and the specific cultural identity of Texas, the martyrdom of the Alamo acted as the ultimate spiritual catalyst that fueled the rapid, near-unstoppable rise of a transcontinental global superpower. The legendary battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," became much more than a localized military shout. It was transformed into an ideological doctrine that justified the aggressive, high-speed expansion of a continental empire from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The mythic status achieved by Travis, Bowie, and Crockett provided the rapidly growing American Republic with a powerful, highly standardized pantheon of secular martyrs whose perceived purity of purpose could be continuously invoked to legitimize future military interventions, frontier expansions, and global projections of power throughout the entire 20th century. The story of the Alamo became a foundational pillar of the American Western mythos, establishing a cultural template that celebrated raw individualistic masculinity, unyielding collective resolve, and a fatalistic willingness to die for abstract ideological principles, deeply shaping the literature, cinema, and political rhetoric of the modern West. Yet, as the 21st century continues to advance, the modern physical site of the Alamo finds itself operating in a state of profound, highly vibrant intellectual transition. The ongoing, multi-million-dollar structural and educational transformation of Alamo Plaza in downtown San Antonio represents a monumental effort to bridge the deep chasm between romanticized national folklore and the uncompromising demands of objective, inclusive modern history. Modern museum curators, archaeologists, and cultural historians are systematically working to dismantle the outdated, highly simplistic mid-century Hollywood myths, replacing them with a highly sophisticated, multi-layered narrative that honors the complete human history of the site. This modern interpretative framework intentionally expands the focus beyond the 60 minutes of combat in 1836, actively recovering the long-lost stories of the indigenous Native American populations who built the mission, the Spanish colonial friars who governed it, the native Tejano patriots who fought for their constitutional rights within its plazas, and the enslaved individuals like Joe, whose forced labor formed the uncredited backbone of the early frontier economy. Ultimately, the eternal verdict of the Alamo lies in its unique, near-miraculous capacity to continuously operate as an unbroken mirror for the universal human condition. It remains the supreme historical testament to the extraordinary, terrifying choices that ordinary, deeply flawed human beings execute when they are forced into the absolute extremity of existential isolation. The men who stood across Travis's line in the dust, fully realizing that no political rescue was coming, and that their physical lives were completely forfeit beneath the blood-red banner of no quarter, did not possess a guaranteed monopoly on moral perfection or flawless political foresight. They were complex, contradictory 19th century individuals driven by a volatile mix of personal ambition, financial speculation, racialized worldview, and genuine, unyielding devotion to regional self-governance and personal honor. By choosing to stay, fight, and die beneath the shattered ruins of the old Franciscan mission rather than surrender to the overwhelming machinery of a military dictatorship, they knowingly and purposefully surrendered their physical bodies to the grave so that their names might achieve a permanent, unyielding grip upon the global historical consciousness. Their tragic, spectacular sacrifice ensured that the story of this tiny 3-acre compound would outlive the vast empires of their era, standing forever amidst the glass and steel of the modern world as an eternal, unbroken reminder of the absolute cost of ideological conviction. A timeless beacon proving with absolute historical finality that when all hope of physical survival has been completely stripped away, the ultimate, most enduring fortress a human being can choose to defend is his own unyielding sense of honor, duty, and individual liberty.